Hardy and the Changeling Hybrid by M.R. Dale. Narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 8. Repercussions. About 10 minutes after the dragon had gone, the girls had rejoined the rest of the school on the playground. The fire at the fence had burnt itself out, but shards of glass from the broken windows remained strewn everywhere. When the all-clear had been given, every single child was summoned to the school hall to talk about what had happened. Sophie, Clara and Yasmin had agreed that it was probably best to just keep quiet and not say anything. Since Pinkleton Primary had no head teacher at the moment, responsibility for delivering this chat fell to the school's deputy head and teacher of Year 3, Mrs. Jones, who had taught Sophie, Clara and Yasmin when they were 7. The children thought she was wonderful. She had a gentle face and long brown hair which she sometimes wore beads in to stand out from the crowd. Her glasses were enormous and freckles dominated her nose and upper cheeks. "Did anyone see what happened on the field?" she asked every child in school very calmly. Silence blanketed the hall. "Nobody? OK. Can anyone tell me anything about what they think has happened here?" she asked again, all the time maintaining complete composure. The children didn't know her as someone who shouted a lot or who got very animated. "Wasn't there a dragon on the field?" a younger child shouted out. "That's what we're trying to work out, my lovely," she said, bending down to reassure the Year 1 child that everything was okay. Ryan Myers put his hand up and Sophie could see delight dancing in his eyes that he might be about to get someone in trouble. "We couldn't see anything, miss. The fence was in the way, and when Sophie pressed the fire alarm, we all ran outside." Mrs. Jones listened attentively, and you could see her studying what it was she was hearing very calmly. Eventually she replied, "Sophie, my dear, why did you press the fire alarm?" Every pair of eyes were now glued on Sophie. It was like being interrogated by nearly 200 people. Sophie assured herself that she hadn't done anything wrong, and so replied confidently, "Because I thought everyone might be in danger if we stayed in the building. Whatever it was sounded like it was heading for school, so I decided it would be best to get everyone as far away as possible," Sophie replied, maintaining as much composure as Mrs. Jones. "And did Mrs. Phoenix give you permission to do that?" Mrs. Jones asked. "No, this was after she'd left the room," Sophie replied, perfectly happy in her recounting of events and also secretly slightly pleased with herself that she'd planted a seed of doubt about Mrs. Phoenix. "Do you know why she left the room?" Mrs. Jones was probing, but in the nicest way possible. "Don't know, miss. She seemed a bit nervous," Sophie said, honestly. Standing at the side of the hall, away from the other teachers, Mrs. Phoenix blurted out, I went to get help," but Mrs. Jones just ignored her. "Thank you, Sophie," Mrs. Jones finished. "It seems you acted quickly, but I do think you probably should have waited for Mrs. Phoenix to come back." Sophie stared at Mrs. Jones. She wanted to scream at her that she knew full well that Mrs. Phoenix had no intention of coming back, and that if it wasn't for her, then all the debris may well have fallen on a child. She knew she acted in everyone's best interests, but Mrs. Jones couldn't see that. Slumped down on the bench at the back, Sophie found it hard to concentrate on what was being said now, so she just mulled on what had been a very polite criticism, but one that, if Mrs. Jones had been in full possession of the facts, didn't need to be made. After the brief talk from Mrs. Jones and a few of the teachers, the children were told that nobody knew exactly what had happened on the field. To them, everything was unexplainable. Sophie, Clara and Yasmin knew better, though. As everyone was about to stand up and be dismissed, the hall door flew open and Kingsley hobbled in with tissues under his nose, which must have started white but were now covered in blood. Mrs. Jones was the first to speak. "Kingsley, what on earth has happened to you?" Kingsley scanned the back row of the hall, which contained Year 6, until he found Sophie. "She punched me in the face," he said angrily, pointing at Sophie. Once again, everyone turned to look at her. Trying to look as innocent as she possibly could, Sophie pointed at herself and silently mouthed, "Me? Are you quite sure, Kingsley? Sophie Hardy?" Mrs. Jones asked. "Yes, her, the blonde one that was on the internet," Kingsley replied, not taking his eyes off Sophie. Mrs. Jones squinted in thought and looked back at Sophie, who was still attempting to look completely like butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. This, though, was quite difficult, as Sophie was still a bit cross at Mrs. Jones. However, Sophie focused enough to change from the girl who was angry to the popular, well-behaved good girl that everyone knew her as. Under this guise, she was sure she could get away with it. "Did anyone see this happen?" Mrs. Jones asked without taking her eyes off Sophie. Of course, nobody spoke, as Yasmin and Clara weren't about to drop their best friend in it. "Come with me, the pair of you," Mrs. Jones said. The rest of the school was dismissed, but Sophie and Kingsley followed Mrs. Jones to what used to be Mr. Houghton's office. "Wait here, please," Mrs. Jones said as she went inside. Sophie and Kingsley were left to stand outside, on either side of the door. Sophie couldn't bring herself to look Kingsley in the eye. As she watched him mop the blood off his top lip again, she was now feeling slightly bad for punching him. But then she remembered the horrible thing he had done, and soon the fleeting feeling of sympathy was gone. After a few moments, Mrs. Jones emerged from the office. "I've spoken to your mum, Kingsley. She said she'll be here at home time to speak with me about what has happened." Kingsley nodded his head. "Now, go and get cleaned up." Kingsley walked off down the corridor towards the classroom and walked into the toilets on his way. "I can't get hold of your mum, Sophie. Is her implant on?" "It must be Dad's turn with it and he's at work. We only have one now," Sophie replied. Maintaining the role of model pupil was still her most natural guise. "Keep trying. I'm sure Mum will have it back soon." Mrs. Jones looked very concerned by what Sophie had just told her. "Why have you only got one?" she asked. "We can only afford one now," Sophie replied. Mrs. Jones put her hand on Sophie's shoulder. "If you need to talk about anything, you know where I am," she said, sounding as understanding as possible. Mrs. Jones was well known for this. Sophie didn't take her kindness for granted, but noticed that she'd set the fire alarm off, must have gotten Mrs. Phoenix in some sort of trouble by saying she left the room, dealt with a dragon and some changelings on the school field, lied about it, punched a boy in the face and lied about that too, but was getting sympathy and understanding as a result. This continued to niggle away at Sophie. Her reputation was allowing her to get away with all sorts. "Thank you, miss," she said assuredly, "but I'm okay, honest." Mrs. Jones was in no rush to let this go, though, and pressed on with the concern for Sophie's home life that she now had. "That's as may be. However, I will still need to speak to your mum at home time as well to try and solve this. I can't do it now because I have to teach my class. I need you to stay in at break and lunchtime to avoid any complaints from Kingsley's mum just in case you have done something wrong." Mrs. Jones was so gentle and calm, and Sophie thought that she may as well serve a punishment, as she had done the thing she was being accused of, and that is what well-behaved role model pupils would do. They wouldn't argue back or get cross. They would take the punishment as adults were there to be respected and listened to. Sophie realised that if she wanted to keep getting away with the odd white lie, she would have to maintain her good girl reputation for the majority of the time. "OK, miss, I will." And Sophie strutted off back to the classroom, confident in her mind that this thing with Kingsley would blow over just like the white lies she had told her mum and Miss Sissons. To keep them separate, Mrs. Phoenix had moved Kingsley to what should have been Sophie's seat originally, behind Clara and Yasmin. Sophie, meanwhile, was left with Ryan, who hadn't forgot about another lie Sophie had told that morning, or that his explanation about the fire alarm hadn't resulted in the revenge he wanted, and was stewing and biding his time. The rest of the morning went off without drama, and it was left to Mrs. Tabard to act as a stand-in caretaker to clean the glass up before dinner time, which would now have to be on the playground, not the field, to avoid anyone having to walk through the shards. Sophie did her English quietly, but couldn't help but feel like she was being watched by both Ryan and Kingsley. It was quite disconcerting. Before Clara and Yasmin went out for dinner, Sophie sneakily checked with them that they had contacted Miss Sissons about what had happened. They had done, but because of the damage done to the field, they would have to wait until home time to zone out to scope, as the playground contained no secluded spots like the field did, and therefore they'd be unable to zone out and remain undetected, especially with Ryan and Kingsley both keeping a very watchful eye out. As dinner time started, Sophie shuffled her way down to the detention table at the school entrance. It was where children were sent if they had to miss any break or dinner, somewhere Sophie had never had to go before. Sophie slumped in the chair and just sat there. She would have zoned out to help pass the time, but Mrs. Tabard would be in and out of the entrance hall checking that she hadn't run off or done anything else un-Sophie-like, and it wasn't worth the risk of being caught by her. A few moments later, Kingsley joined her, and the pair sat in silence. After a few minutes of awkwardness, Sophie decided to break the silence. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Kingsley didn't reply. He just sat there with his hands over his ears as he had done in the classroom. Sophie wasn't going to take silence for an answer this time. She had just stared at the face of a dragon, so Kingsley didn't scare her one bit. As a result, she forcefully pulled one of his hands away from his ear. "I asked you a question. Why did you do it?" she asked a lot more firmly. The fury that had made her punch Kingsley was starting to emerge again. Kingsley didn't take his eyes off the table in front of him and didn't move his other hand. He just replied, "I was protecting me and my mum." "What do you mean?" Sophie asked, slightly softer. She could see he wasn't lying. "Those women are always looking for us. They follow us everywhere and try to take us away," Kingsley replied. Unsure of what to make of what she was hearing, Sophie asked another question. "Why are changelings looking for you?" Kingsley still didn't move. He just shrugged and muttered something about hybrids and keeping his mum safe. It was nothing that Sophie hadn't heard firsthand on the field. Kingsley wasn't sure himself, never mind being able to explain it to somebody else. "Are you frightened?" Sophie asked, thinking that she already knew the answer to the question. Kingsley finally turned to look at her and nodded with a tear in his eye. "They've been after us since my mum came back. When I lived with all my foster parents, I'd never seen them before, but ever since Mum came for me, they've been trying to take us." Sophie realised she was getting an insight into Kingsley's life that he didn't normally show, so she pressed on, choosing her words carefully. Kingsley, on the other hand, was quite grateful that somebody was taking an interest in him and not just signing him off as naughty and not the sort of child others didn't want to be friends with. "When did your mum come back?" she asked. "Not long ago. About 6 weeks," he replied. Sophie did the maths and made a rough assumption about the event that had happened to her 6 weeks ago, that the changelings and or Kingsley's mum had escaped Satfor and gone looking for Kingsley. "So changelings started coming for you 6 weeks ago, but before that you'd never seen any?" Again, she thought she knew what was coming. Kingsley nodded and Sophie sat back in her chair and realised that this was all her doing. This meant that she also felt compelled to strike up a friendship with Kingsley to help him deal with it in a way that she wished she could do with Katie. If Kingsley was being hunted by mythicals that she had unleashed, then it was only fair to help Kingsley in any way she could. "What is this blue stuff that flows around your body?" Sophie asked, gaining confidence that she was earning Kingsley's trust. "Something that my mum showed me." Kingsley was talking a bit more easily now. "She can do it too, but I'm better than she is," he said with a smile that implied that what he had said wasn't entirely true. "You've used it before?" Sophie probed. "Every time those things come after us," Kingsley replied. "I have to use it to get rid of them." "Have you always had it?" "No, it just started when Mum came back. She said she first used it accidentally. She said she didn't know or can't remember what she was doing and got rid of my foster parents," Kingsley continued to explain. "You're a really good shot," Sophie added, really going for the friendship building. Kingsley smiled for the first time. "Thanks, but I'd never seen it go through someone the way it went through you." Sophie smiled as well. She knew exactly why it had gone through her and not hit her, but she wasn't about to reveal to Kingsley that it was because she'd been a projection of herself and not been there. Not fully, anyway. It might be too much for him to take. "You aren't the only one with special powers, you know," she said flippantly. Kingsley smiled again. He had never met anyone that he could talk to like this before, or that wanted to talk to him. This was what he'd been waiting for, someone to talk to. They hadn't gotten off to the best start, granted. Now, though, Sophie seemed like she had the potential to be someone he could share things with in his quest to make friends and help others. Seeing that the mood was a lot more relaxed, Sophie chimed in with, "We can protect you and your mum if you want us to." Kingsley nodded, and Sophie could see that he had waited a long time to hear someone say something like that to him. The rest of the school day passed pretty much without incident. Clara and Yasmin were still waiting for Miss Sissons to get back to them. Other than that, the afternoon just consisted of Mrs. Phoenix talking about the habitats of creatures and how they adapted. Sophie thought it would be much more exciting to learn about the habitats of mythicals from years ago, and how there seemed to be so many different sorts of species, all needing completely different environments to live in. But given what had happened this morning, Mrs. Phoenix didn't agree. At home time, Kingsley and Sophie were kept back by Mrs. Phoenix and walked down to Class 3, where they were met by Mrs. Jones, who was just showing her class out. Amelia and Tom were there, although Amelia looked exhausted or ill, and what Sophie deduced must have been Kingsley's mum was there as well. She had long, dark hair in dreadlocks and kind eyes. This wasn't the face of someone who would harm anyone or anything, Sophie thought. She then realised that she had made this assumption before, but then it turned out that they were not the person she thought they were. As a result, she kept her guard up. "What's this about, Soph?" Tom asked. Sophie just kept quiet and stood sheepishly next to him. "What happened, Kingsley?" Desmeralda asked. Kingsley studied her carefully before he answered, like he was trying to work out what kind of mood she was in. Seeing she was relaxed, but a bit distressed about having to be called into school on her son's first day, he hugged her and just said, "Nothing, Mum." A few seconds later, Mrs. Jones came to the classroom door and beckoned everybody in. Mrs. Phoenix joined them, having finished seeing her class out. They all sat round on the really small chairs and Mrs. Jones started the conversation. "Kingsley, would you like to tell everyone what you told the whole school earlier today?" she asked gently. Kingsley sat there, huddled up to his mum. He just shook his head. Mrs. Jones turned to Sophie's parents. "Tom, Amelia, earlier on today, Kingsley claimed that Sophie punched him." Tom laughed, but Amelia looked horrified, making her ill complexion even more exaggerated. "Sophie?" Tom asked, still laughing. "This Sophie?" he said, pointing at his daughter. "Yes," Mrs. Jones replied, not seeing the funny side. Tom realised that she was serious and stopped laughing immediately. He was covered in blood and staggered into the hall, claiming that Sophie had hit him, Mrs. Jones continued. "Is this true, Sophie?" her mum asked. Before Sophie could get a word out, Kingsley interrupted her. "No," he said, letting go of his mum. "Pardon?" Mrs. Phoenix snorted. Kingsley shifted uncomfortably in his chair before explaining what he and Sophie both knew to be a lie. "I fell over on the way out of the classroom when the fire alarm went off and I banged my face." Sophie looked at him, wondering what on earth he was doing, but also wondered if another lie was about to play into her hands. "Well, that certainly makes more sense than Sophie punching a boy she'd only just met," Tom exclaimed. "Is that what happened, Kingsley?" Mrs. Jones asked, very suspiciously. "Yes, I'm sorry I lied earlier. I just wasn't sure. I was nervous on my first day and didn't want to seem stupid in front of everyone," Kingsley said, and Sophie discreetly smiled at him. Mrs. Jones looked at him and sensed that he might be a child for the teachers across the school to watch. She knew what she had just heard didn't make sense, but she couldn't do anything else about it. "OK, it seems there may have been a bit of a misunderstanding then," Mrs. Jones said, slightly embarrassed. "I'm sorry for calling you all in." All this time, Sophie had been studying Kingsley and his mum. They were extremely close, but she hadn't said a word to anyone else other than Kingsley the whole time she'd been there. She had never seen that kind of behaviour in an adult. Adults always spoke to each other in Sophie's experience. Everyone stood up to leave, and they began to walk towards the door. Then Mrs. Jones remembered something. "Tom, Amelia, can you stay for a minute? There's something else I'd like to ask you about," Mrs. Jones asked, and Sophie quickly guessed what this was going to be about. "Of course," Tom replied, and he clutched Amelia's arm, pulling her back to the chair as it seemed Sophie's mum was so tired that she hadn't even heard the request. "She hasn't kicked a dinner lady as well, has she?" Tom laughed. He smiled and winked at Sophie. Sophie smiled back, but held in what would have been a forced laugh. Kingsley and Desmeralda left the room, and everyone else went to sit down, but Mrs. Jones stopped Sophie where she was. "It's OK, Sophie. You can wait outside if that's OK." Panic hit. She knew exactly why Mrs. Jones wanted to talk to her parents without her. She couldn't well come out and straight up ask, so she had no other choice but to say, "No, that's fine." Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out the car keys. "Here you are. Go and wait in the car if you want. I came straight from work." "Where's Lizzie?" Sophie asked, concerned that her baby sister was nowhere to be seen. "Nan's," replied Amelia, with quite a slur. Amelia's eyes were red. She had seemingly had a very busy day with Lizzie and wasn't in the mood to be talking about her in the brief moment of respite that she had. Sophie left the room and headed towards the car park a few paces behind Kingsley and his mum. Meanwhile, the other adults all sat down in the room to talk about what Sophie guessed was what she had said earlier. The Sophie Hardy Saga was written and produced by Emma Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a hard copy of the book, then be sure to check out www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.